Welcome to the Melting Pod, stories about our dysfunctional immigration system and where we go from here. As your co-hosts, we've served inside the federal government for 2 decades and 4 presidents of both parties.
I'm Claire Trickler-McNulty, and I focus on ICE and immigration enforcement.
I'm Amanda Baran, and I work mostly on humanitarian-based immigration and immigrant women's issues.
I'm Doug Rand, and I focus on work-based immigration and U.S. citizenship.
I'm really excited for today because I feel like the term fraud has been just a bludgeon that has been used over and over and over again, starting years ago in different ways to attack different parts of certainly the immigration process, but also lots of other areas. And so I think this is just a really timely and important topic for us to dive into. So I'm excited we have an expert with us, Sonya Schwartz. Sonya, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Sonya Schwartz, and I'm glad to be here today. I work on public benefits and immigrant families' access to programs like access to healthcare programs, food assistance, housing, and other interactions with government like voting.
Sonya, for whom do you work?
I work for the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition.
What's that?
It's an organization made up of more than 700 members at this point all across the country that work on access to healthcare, access to food assistance, making sure that everyone has access to what they need when they fall on hard times for short, periods of time.
And Sonya, how did you get into all this work? Like, tell us about your journey. I mean, I think we love hearing about our guests and how they got into what they're doing.
I'll give you the short version. Went to law school, thought I was going to be a great civil rights litigator, bringing cases to the Supreme Court, fighting for justice, and realized I actually thought it was much more fun to help people make sure they had access to benefits like Medicaid. I work with people with HIV, and access to medications or Medicaid literally saved their life, not to mention housing programs like the Ryan White Act program, and just fell in love with these really complicated programs, helping people untangle them to make sure that they stayed enrolled and could get the help that they need. And then a lot of my clients were able to return to work. It was a really exciting time. And then I've just stuck with these programs all along. I think the immigrant piece is that immigrants face some of the biggest challenges, even for U.S. citizen kids and their families, in enrolling in programs they need and staying enrolled. And that's why I ended up working a lot on immigrants in particular.
Did you ever work for the government?
Nope, I didn't. I've always been an advocate.
Well, I just want to say, I know from personal and professional experience that Sonya may not have worked in government, but Sonya knows more than just about anyone in government about the issues she knows about. And so I feel very fortunate to have worked with Sonya for now, the better part of a decade, because her expertise has been invaluable in so many critical issues that we worked on back when we were in government. And I also just want to say, Sonya, the immigration system is just wickedly complicated, and the public benefits system in this country is possibly as or more wickedly complicated. And so the fact that you are an expert in both, I think puts you in very rare company. I think it's very rare to meet somebody who can actually really understand what's going on in these 2 overlapping mazes and still have a smile on their face. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Take this compliment sandwich any day of the week. Thank you. I understand the pieces of immigration and the pieces of public benefits I need to be able to do this work. But there's a lot. So we'll see.
It does sound like you might be an extremely high-level expert, though, in administrative burden and how complicated these systems can be on the people they touch.
That's the common theme in all the work is how do we smooth out this administrative burden to make these programs work?
But that's what you would hope the goal is, right? I'm not clear that is necessarily the goal. It's not.
Yeah, right. It was our goal back in the day too, but it's hard enough to reduce burdens when that's your goal. It's another story entirely when the goal is to create burdens, which I'm sure we'll get into.
So, like Claire mentioned, fraud has really become the centerpiece of Trump's immigration rhetoric. And I thought it'd be interesting to go through how we got there, right? And I think ever since he came down that golden escalator, people always like to reference, he's had this message, right? Immigrants are here to steal your jobs, your benefits, your elections, your safety. And for a long time, the rhetoric about immigration had been about, national security and economics. And he really pushed this fraud narrative. And it feels like almost within that 10 years, every year or 2, he would push another aspect of it. So, in the beginning, it was like criminal fraud. We have all these criminals pouring over the borders. Then voter fraud, right? Like during election time. And then really when he became president, his administration really pushed this issue of welfare fraud, right? Like, oh, all of these immigrants are here and they're trying to, take money from our treasury, right?
Right. I want to emphasize that it wasn't an issue. It was a lie. They made it
Yes.
an issue.
100%. I mean, this is all like a narrative he's trying to push to get people spun up, like hateful people spun up. Asylum fraud. And now in the second term, he's gone all out. And, this framing, like Doug has said, it's never required evidence. All it is repetition over and over and over for it to burrow into people's minds. So much so that there is now a White House task force to eliminate fraud set up in March of 2026, led by the Vice President, J.D. Vance. And when you read the chart, I don't know if it's like executive order or presidential proclamation or whatever, it really talks about fraud being perpetrated by individuals, a lot of immigrants. I mean, we're going to talk later on about who is actually perpetrating the fraud, but here we are, right?
Spoiler alert, it's not immigrants.
So we're going to discuss today 3 main areas that the Trump administration is pushing on the American public about fraud, right? So public benefits, voting, and immigration applications. They're saying that these 3 areas are rife with fraud, and they point to immigrants a lot about who's perpetrating.
I think I agree that there's a huge threat of immigrants in fraud, but there's a real racist sort of undertone to it, because the people that are committing the fraud are Haitians, they're Somalis, they're people from, Central and South America. The messages that they send out constantly with the photos of people who've committed crimes, they're almost all Latino men of a certain age. It's incredibly racially focused and fear-based.
I just want to underscore that because we all know that there are plenty of white faces that could be plastered around as, committing fraud, convicted for fraud, all of these things. But those cases really, I know we're going to talk about more, but are not rising to the top.
I'm sure that's just an oversight. We're going to start with the relentless allegations that immigrants are committing fraud in our social safety net programs. Welfare fraud, for example. So just late last year, a 23-year-old YouTuber named Nick Shirley put out a 42-minute video that went viral, claiming widespread fraud at Somali-run daycares in Minneapolis, which got way more traction than it had any right to, ignited a political firestorm, despite state investigators finding no evidence of fraud at the specific sites he visited. So he was going up to like random daycares and knocking on the door and saying, let me in, I need to see evidence of children, which is
I remember that. That was
serious.
crazy.
Yeah.
Like, who's opening the door to randos, not, asking for that, to see children?
Yeah. But as with everything, there's a kernel of truth. It wasn't the fraud he was alleging, but nevertheless, the video got huge rocket fuel from the vice president, from Elon Musk, from then Attorney General Pam Bondi, an endless number of Republican legislative staffers who were reportedly the ones who supplied this YouTuber with the information beforehand. So it's just this perpetual motion machine of lies. Now, again, the controversy has real roots. At the time this video posted, federal prosecutors had already charged 92 people in a real demonstrable fraud scheme from the COVID era in Minnesota, 62 people convicted. But the Trump administration dramatically inflated this issue. Trump claimed losses exceeding $19 billion in his State of the Union address with no supporting evidence, and used this whole fraud investigation, the real fraud investigation, to just disgustingly target Minnesota's Somali immigrant community, calling immigrants garbage and ending temporary protected status for Somalis without any evidence of individualized fraud or gang activity or terrorist activity or what have you. I mean, just like threw the rhetorical book at this community in the most horrifying way.
I remember hearing this and it landed so hard. I mean, I think about Ilhan Omar hearing that and needing to put that away, but also how that must feel for her and for all the people that she represents,
I don't know why anybody would work for this man. I don't know why anyone would be a political appointee. I don't care if you're the Department of Transportation or whatever. Remember during the first term after Charlottesville, a number of Trump political appointees for a hot second were actually calling out the apparent endorsement of white supremacy and felt really some indigestion about working for him. And then it all passed. Now they're not even doing that, right? It's just part of the day to day. And I would just challenge anybody from any group, white, black, brown, what have you, like whatever community you're a part of, just do a find and replace and put yourself in that quote instead of Somali Americans and tell me how you feel. And I wish more people, including people in the MAGA movement, had the presence of mind to just do that very simple shoe is on the other foot exercise. I mean, as a Jewish person, it's instinctive. I wish more Jewish people, honestly, would do this exercise. But yeah, this rhymes with some stuff that's pretty ugly. it's not a hard analogy to make when you start calling an entire group, ethnically defined group, garbage.
Yeah.
We know where this can lead.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that whole episode is what turned into the operation in Minnesota, right? Like it was almost like a snowball. And then all of a sudden we have these armed men roaming around Minneapolis, and we all saw what happened and talked about what happened. The killing of Renee Good, the killing of Alex Preddy, and then finally the operation ended. What came after was this very violent policy response. And one of the things that I think this whole episode led to was the 75 country policy that came out of the State Department. So, Sonya, can you tell us a little bit about that policy?
Sure. So one day we were shocked to find out that the State Department had announced that it froze processing of immigrant visas. That's basically what you apply for if you have a family member in the U.S. You've often waited on a list for 20 years to finally come get your interview for immigrant visa, and announced that if you were from one of 75 countries, we'll talk in a minute about what types of countries those were, that was going to be paused. You were going to have no control over or no hope to really make your way to the U.S. anytime soon. They said it was because people in those countries were highly likely to be public charges and depend on federal public benefits programs.
What is a public charge? Where does that term come from? What does that even mean? This term public charge is the only thing that the Trump administration has invoked to justify banning immigration from 75 countries. What the hell does it mean? Where does it come from?
So it comes from the immigration law, and it was modeled after a concept from a long time ago when people immigrated. Some people came to our country, did have illnesses or disabilities that led them to live in a poorhouse, basically be like institutionalized in America. And so a public charge is someone who is primarily dependent on government for subsistence. And that definition has been kind of blown up and narrowed over the years for political purposes. But for the last, let's say, almost 30 years, 25 years, it's generally meant someone who relies on specific public benefits programs that include cash assistance, which people use for their actual income, not just like some money that you might get from FEMA in an emergency, but actual something that you receive every month.
It's what a normal person would call welfare, right?
Yeah, it's what a normal person would call welfare. Or if you're actually institutionalized for long-term care, not like if you go to the hospital and then you have to rehab for your broken hip for a couple of weeks, but if you're actually in an institution for a long period of time for your care and it's paid for by the federal government, those are the only ways in which someone would be considered a public charge under the current policy in the U.S. For people coming in from abroad, there's a different policy that's very confusing and very discretionary now. And one of the pieces of it is that in 75 countries, you're just actually paused. There's no real reason even to have an interview or to start the process because you're indefinitely paused.
And they're paused because the government is saying, we don't know if you're going to take like public benefits.
We're paused because often you're from a country in the Southern Hemisphere. You're usually not white, and sort of a way of thinking that because you're from one of those countries, you're going to come here, you're not going to have skills, you're not going to apply yourself, and you're going to be a public charge. And it's all just conjecture. It makes no sense.
I remember the 75 countries, when that came out, everyone was trying to figure out like, oh, how did they pick these 75 countries? And it came from some tweet or truth. Is that what they call them on the social? The truthy that the president posted of 75 countries, he said had high rates of welfare. I mean, that's like psycho. Was that even grounded in data?
Doug, why don't you take this one?
It was the end of January. So it's while Operation Metro Surge is full swing, right? No one in America is talking about anything other than the ICE shock troops raging through Minneapolis. And meanwhile, the State Department.
ICE and Border Patrol. Sorry.
ICE and Border Patrol and FBI and God knows, all federal law enforcement officers surging into Minneapolis. It was arresting the whole country's attention. And in the meantime, the State Department just very quietly releases a tiny press release called Immigrant Visa Processing Updates for Nationalities at High Risk of U.S. Public Benefits Reliance. And it's really short. And it just says, effective January 21st, 2026, the Department of State paused all visa issuances to immigrant visa applicants who are nationals of the following countries, the 75 countries. And there's a frequently asked questions, which is a funny thing to call it because it was a brand new announcement. What happens to my visa? What happens to my interview appointment? Oh, you can still do your interview. Are there any exceptions? You had a couple exceptions like adoption and dual nationals. It's like there's barely any Q&A. And that's it. That's all they said. And I think through a combination of the fact that journalists were focused on Minneapolis, This was characterized as a pause other than a ban. It got almost no attention, even though, unlike other things we could talk about where it was kind of like all bluster and not a lot of impact, this is hugely impactful. This is tens of thousands of spouses of U.S. citizens, children of U.S. citizens, parents of U.S. citizens, other relatives of U.S. citizens, employees of U.S. companies who cannot come to the United States, who are stuck abroad. And it's gotten almost no scrutiny. It's crazy. So I'm glad we're talking about it. And sorry, one more thing. Sonya, I hope this doesn't give you PTSD, but the only justification in this State Department statement is the Department of State is undergoing a full review of all screening and vetting policies to ensure that immigrants from high-risk countries do not unlawfully utilize welfare in the United States or become a public charge. That's it. There's no data. There's no justification. Sonya from outside government and myself inside government spent, I don't know, the better part of 2 or 3 years working on a public charge regulation that was like stuffed with data and went through all these legal checks and balances to define public charge in a rigorous way so that people would know what they do need to worry about and what they don't need to worry about. And they got litigated 6 ways from Sunday. And then here comes the Trump administration and they just put out like a half-page press release and they're done. And they've just banned immigration from 75 countries. It's insane.
That's crazy.
Now, there is litigation ongoing. It's being challenged, and I hope that the good guys win. But you want to know where it came from. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot. But
No, it's good.
Sonya and I and a lot of other terrific advocates have looked into this, and it would be funny if it weren't so gross and disgusting and racist. But basically, it's almost like Stephen Miller saw the world as like a jigsaw puzzle. And so the first thing they did last year was bring back the Muslim ban, which is a whole different set of authorities that the president has in our immigration laws to ban people who are quote unquote against the national interest. And so they expanded that to include a bunch of countries in Africa, a bunch of Muslim majority countries, plus a couple of like red herring countries that are neither, like Venezuela, to basically keep this thing from being so obviously racist on its face that it couldn't survive a court challenge. So that was step one. So then this new State Department policy comes out, the quote unquote pause, which is effectively a ban. And it's like, it beautifully fills in all the puzzle pieces. It gets you the entire rest of Africa, except for a few countries in Southern Africa. It gets you Pakistan and a bunch of other Muslim majority countries. And so now, believe it or not, I ran the numbers. If you look at all Muslim majority countries and all African countries, immigrants abroad are over 90% banned from these countries. So they did it. They got their permanent restriction on immigration of disfavored groups. While America was focused on Minneapolis, which itself was justified by lies about fraud, the administration, with another hand, banned immigration from 75 additional countries, mostly Muslim majority and African countries, also based on lies about fraud.
So Sonya, what exactly are public benefits? Who is actually eligible and what immigrants are eligible for public benefits?
That's a big question. Let's start with some basics. Public benefits are programs that the federal and state governments provide to people, usually people who are low income, who may need access to some services for some time just to stay healthy and active. So for example, Medicaid is the biggest one for low income people. It's the biggest transfer of federal dollars to states. SNAP is what we used to call food stamps, and it's a food assistance program for families. That one's complicated because it's based on the size of your family, and benefits can be provided to just one member of your family or a number of members. There are other food assistance programs like school meals that help all kids in schools, make sure that they are healthy and fed so they can concentrate. There's a breakfast one. There's a lunch one people are familiar with. There's a program called WIC, which is for new moms and babies that helps them just for a certain period of time till kids are 4 and make sure that they have what they need to be able to provide nutritious food and helps with either breastfeeding or formula. And there's some housing programs. People are on waiting lists for decades to get into one of these programs. They're not entitlement programs like Medicaid and SNAP. The government doesn't have to serve everyone who's eligible. They just have a certain amount of money that goes into the pot. And people on the list sort of who are eligible go from there. But basically for all these programs, you have to have a very low income. They're all a little bit different. And different states have different income levels for different programs. You have to either be a U.S. citizen or meet very specific immigrant requirements, which we'll talk about in a minute. In more and more programs, you also have to meet a work requirement. You may remember in 1986, when Clinton was in office and Newt Gingrich shook back Congress, they changed welfare as we knew it, and they created a program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. Under that program, people have to work or they can be exempt from work requirements for specific things, but mostly they have to work and they get cut off after a certain time. So there's a lot of very specific requirements that are confirmed by either paper documentation or different government databases before you actually get enrolled in a program. It's pretty rigorous.
The bar is already high. Is that what you're saying? Like the bar is already high to access this for anyone.
It's super, super high.
We're not a generous country with our social safety net for anyone.
No. I think one thing to think about, I think it's easiest to just take one program and talk through a little bit of what eligibility looks like for immigrants. So I thought we'd take Medicaid since it's the big one. It's where the most money really is. And in some ways, the biggest benefit if you need healthcare. So anyone who was really a legal immigrant before 1996 was treated like a U.S. citizen for the purpose of, let's say, a healthcare program or a food assistance program. In 1996, Newt Gingrich and Clinton actually really restricted things to just certain groups of legal immigrants. So for example, someone who had a green card or someone who, let's say, was an asylee or a refugee. But even someone with a green card under the Newt Gingrich plan in 96, that's been our law for more than 30 years now, and has to wait 5 years before even becoming eligible for benefits. Congress last summer, H.R. 1, which, the president calls the big, beautiful bill. Other people have other names for it. But basically, it was way more restrictive than what they did in 96 with Newt Gingrich. Under this bill, even someone who is a refugee in this country or someone who has earned asylum in this country would no longer be eligible for a program like Medicaid or SNAP. They might become eligible when they get their green card, but it's complicated and we're afraid that states aren't going to really figure this out and people are going to fall off. They're not going to get back on the program when they get their green card.
I mean, that is so horrible. Isn't the whole point of these programs is to create healthy communities, especially after COVID? Public health is being affected, right?
I think it's important just to have some context. So for kids in the U.S., more than 50% of kids in the U.S. get their healthcare through Medicaid. And the reason they do that is they want all kids in the classroom to have glasses. They want all kids in the classroom to go get their immunizations. Most people do, at least, in terms of immigration enforcement, but also in terms of immigration benefits. Parents are going to become, and they already are, more and more afraid to keep their kids enrolled in programs. So we will see that there will be more haves and have-nots in the classroom.
The fact that so few people can actually access this because of the law, the fact that the administration is still pursuing this narrative of immigrants draining the coffers, I don't even have words for it. I don't even know what to say about that.
Well, again, we know where this leads when you call a group of people a parasite.
And isn't it, immigrants by and large pay taxes? And I feel like I've seen information about how those taxes are helping, Social Security, which I think of as another public benefit, right?
Sonya, can I make some statements? You tell me if they're true or false.
Sure.
Okay. Number one, undocumented immigrants are not eligible for any public benefits, period. True or false? False? Sorry, let me back up for a second. Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for any federal public benefits.
False. They're two.
Damn it. Wait,
They're
okay.
Medicaid,
They're eligible for emergency Medicaid for labor and delivery. They're eligible for school meals. All kids are eligible for school meals, basically. And in most places, even kids who have higher incomes are eligible because they have community eligibility. We just want kids getting school meals, basically. We've decided that as a society. Yeah. And WIC, which is really because people want to make sure babies have historically have a
undocumented
chance.
Immigrant moms and kids are eligible for WIC?
Yes, the moms are now, except for in Idaho. States can choose to restrict.
What? Like, it's
yeah.
Idaho.
Mm-hmm.
Congrats, Idaho. You're the only state that doesn't think that moms should have sufficient nutrition for themselves.
Indiana used to be in that camp, and they changed their minds over realizing that it just didn't make any sense. We want moms who are taking care of babies to be healthy too. And you only get the benefit, I think, until a year postpartum. That's it. It's a very time limited and very small benefit, honestly. I mean, you get nutrition consultations, you might get formula, but you're not making a 5-star meal with those resources.
Right. Sonya, true or false? Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for welfare.
True.
Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for food stamps.
True.
Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for normal Medicaid that's like not ER visits and labor and delivery.
Very true. True.
Okay. Fun fact. Here's an AP poll from not that long ago that asked Americans, when immigrants come illegally to the United States, how much of a risk is each of the following? 32% of people said that voting illegally was a major risk. 30% said it's a major risk that jobs available to American workers will be reduced. 37% said that committing crimes is a major risk. But guess what was the top perceived major risk, blowing all the others out of the water. Literally half of respondents said that the biggest risk of immigrants coming illegally to the United States is that the welfare and safety net programs will be burdened.
Gee, I wonder where all of that came from.
It's been here for a long time. It was here in 2000 when we had to fight to get SNAP back for kids. And, it used to be called a welfare magnet. Now
Like magnet meaning like it's attracting illegal immigrants to the United States.
Well, people coming here, they're just dying.
There's delicious food stamps.
For a couple of months. They're trying to get mammograms. I mean,
You're right, Sonya. We have to go there, even though it's easy to be dismissive, but it is absolutely a fundamental pillar of the restrictionist movement that most normal people would have no idea about. It is an article of faith that the entire global South is eager to come to the United States primarily to take advantage of U.S. welfare programs, even though they're not eligible. So even though we've already changed our laws repeatedly to make it impossible for most immigrants of all kinds, let alone undocumented immigrants, the
American
still
citizens
stands.
too. I mean, it's hard enough to get benefits as an American citizen, right?
I don't know if you saw the headlines or the news about kids in SNAP, not immigrant kids, all kids in SNAP have fallen by more than 500,000 in, I think, 15 states.
And that's since last year's big, beautiful bill, right? Which cut Medicaid and food stamps for everybody and gave a giant tax cut to mostly wealthy people.
Yes. And our USDA, which used to do surveys about food insecurity every single year, this administration cut that. They're not even checking in on food insecurity anymore. But the Fed actually released its own survey that said that food insecurity is way up and many families can't provide 3 meals a day for their children in America right now.
There's so much happening and it's so in the weeds, and you're like one of the only people in the country who's actually up to date on all this. Of all the cruel things that this bill did, and there are a lot of them, we can't possibly go into them all. They even took away access to healthcare and food stamps from certain immigrant categories that used to have it.
They took away access to Medicaid and food stamps from refugees and for people who have asylum. And, when people first get to this country, and I've actually helped people myself, the first 6 months to a year is tough. It takes a village to really support families, and neighbors and friends are helping them, but they also need to get groceries on the table. And that first year can mean so much. And then by the second year, often they have a job, they're learning English, they're much more self-sufficient. But to be so cruel as to not help them when they first arrive here is just, it's unprecedented. Newt Gingrich didn't go that far even. And he believed in absolutely no support for anybody. So.
Wow. Newt Gingrich, for our legions of Gen Z listeners, Newt Gingrich was the extremely conservative Speaker of the House during the Clinton era who cooperated with Clinton to restrict welfare for Americans and impose a whole bunch of new restrictions on immigrants in 1996. That's kind of the original sin of a lot of the problems we have with the immigration system today. And sorry, I just have to say this, right? Refugees are legal immigrants. They're eligible for permanent residency. We invited them here after vetting them. So giving them federal assistance is completely reasonable. And when we talk about asylees, we're not talking about asylum seekers. We're not talking about people applying for asylum. We're talking about people who the federal government has said, yes, you have a legitimate fear of persecution. We agree that you have the right to asylum. And so come get a green card and become an American eventually. So it's not unreasonable for them to get assistance as well. We are not talking about undocumented immigrants, and we're not talking about the vast majority of legal immigrants. If you're on an H-1B visa, you're not eligible for benefits. And like Claire said, sorry, got to say this, but you're still paying taxes. Undocumented immigrants are paying taxes.
So Sonya, I mean, fraud exists, right? When there are institutions, regardless of what institution they are, fraud exists because people are human and human beings do, things. So is there fraud in public benefits, and what is the incidence, and who is actually perpetrating the fraud?
Sure. So it's important to separate out fraud into two categories: provider fraud and enrollee fraud. I think the only positive I see is that the administration is mostly focusing on provider fraud. That's where the real money is. Provider fraud is when someone who is allegedly providing a service, it could be a healthcare service like a doctor, it could be food assistance service or childcare service, receives government funds inappropriately. They might double bill for something. They might bill for service they never provided, that sort of thing. And they're drawing down federal funds through these programs. Enrollee fraud instead is when someone who's not eligible for a government program like SNAP or Medicaid somehow makes their way onto the rolls and receives services and benefits. But what I wanted to say is that provider fraud in a program like Medicaid is roughly, we estimate, like the government bodies that do the estimates, estimate it's really about the same as in private insurance and Medicare. If anything, it might be a little bit less, whether it's inspector generals of agencies, whether it's the attorney general and the state looking at state fraud at the state level. We do have to use government resources to identify fraud and to root it out and to put people in jail or make people pay fines. But what's fascinating to me is that in this case, the administration went straight to Minnesota. The fraud you've heard the most about is there, given everything we already talked about. And in Minnesota, the government there, the governor, but mostly the attorney general, had already been investigating rooting out fraud for years and was involved in litigation against some of the perpetrators. And it seemed odd that all of a sudden, really for political reasons, they'd go in and just say they were going to withhold huge amounts of federal dollars from Medicaid in Minnesota all of a sudden. They said that they were going to take away 20% of total Medicaid funding for the quarters. And that actually isn't focused on the person who conducted fraud. It actually just takes money away from the whole program and people that need services. So that just made no sense. And then they went along to try to do something similar in a number of other states, all blue states. And then most recently, we heard a little bit about Florida. I think they threw Florida in. Florida is the most notorious state for provider fraud, and partly because of Medicare, because how many seniors live there and how many medical providers there are there. It's always been notorious. And some seniors are also on Medicaid. And so if Florida is just a place where fraud has been really, really comparatively higher.
But the fraud is, a doctor prescribing, I don't know, like
no,
medical devices.
The doctor saying he did a minor procedure on you and charging, $5,000, like a colonoscopy that they didn't actually perform and charging. That's where the real money is in services.
Yeah.
But it could also be office visits and other things.
Wasn't Brett Favre involved in also in a big welfare fraud scheme?
I don't know.
I think he was.
We're here to tell you about the celebrities committing welfare fraud.
ESPN has reported that he is a defendant in a major civil lawsuit seeking to recover misspent TANF money. So, yeah.
Welfare money. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, I think it was like
Classy.
millions of dollars. Because I was just trying to point out like this extremely famous football player, who has millions and millions of dollars, was definitely very seriously involved in some public benefit fraud. But that's not who they're focusing on, right?
That's his right as an American.
Sonya, anything you want to leave us with on public benefits fraud or anything
We have
else?
to talk about Amy Bach, don't we?
Can we not talk about her?
The ringleader of the Minnesota fraud case is a woman named Amy Bach. Fun fact about Amy Bach, she's not Somali. She's a white woman. You might not know this because the Trump administration doesn't really talk about her a lot when they talk about fraud in Minneapolis and in Minnesota. So just a little point to make there. They're not subtle. I mean, it's really ugly. They're clearly trying to scapegoat certain groups of people and not others, even when the evidence is hiding in plain sight that lots of different kinds of people commit fraud, not only immigrants from disfavored countries.
And it was so bad.
Right.
She's looking at a 41-year prison sentence. That's how bad it was.
So there was real fraud in Minnesota. Like there was fraud. It sounds like the ringleader was not the face that they've put up. It looks like the state was taking action. The federal government had been investigating. They blew it all up. And then also, as we've talked about, you came out of that not only with all the violence in Minneapolis, but also this 75 country ban. So we covered public benefits fraud, and now I think we're going to talk about another type of fraud that you certainly hear a lot about, and that's voter fraud. And alleged fraud. I personally have been bombarded on social media about the SAVE Act, and the absolute burning necessity of passing this law because there's such rampant, non-citizen voting. And if you oppose it, that means that you want non-citizens to vote. I think for me, two of the most effective streams of repeated messaging from MAGA and the Trump campaign have been one, what you're talking about, this is fraud, like immigrants is fraud. And the other one is the Democrats let a lot of people into the country to swing elections, and that they want a permanent majority across the country. And that we're doing that through immigration, both to allow people that aren't eligible to vote. And I guess maybe when those people become eligible to vote, the assumption that they will vote for Democrats. But I hear this a lot. And so I don't know if we can talk a little bit about voter fraud and what you see or what you think about it.
Can I just say this is my favorite topic to talk about because we actually have some data we can dig into that shows how crazy this is. And before I dig into the data, I just want to explain something. So in the last year, we've actually had a lot of tests against a federal system that's not working well to figure out whether people on states' voter lists are actually U.S. citizens or not. And the system that they're using now isn't working great. It can confirm people who are U.S. citizens, but there are a number of people who are U.S. citizens that it can't confirm just because it doesn't have that information in its system or because they can't find the person's name. Maybe they changed their last name, other reasons. But when it confirms someone as a U.S. citizen, that is solid. So a number of red states, playing nice and kissing up to the administration, decided to run their whole entire state voter list through this system, the federal system. I call it SAVE. We don't have to go there on this podcast, but
it stands for Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements.
It was originally designed, as I was talking about before, to make sure that someone who said they had a green card when they applied for Medicaid actually had a green card. That's what it was designed for. Not really designed to prove whether someone's a U.S. citizen. But anyway, that's what they're using. Texas, huge state, incredible example. They ran 18 million registered voters through this system. Guess how many voters they found might be non-citizens? 2,700 or so. When you take that and divide it by the denominator of 18 million, you're at 0.0001 or 0.01% of the people on their rolls. And from that, they turned that data back to the state, and the state gave it to some counties. And Travis County ran their portion of that 2,000 or so people. And they found that 2/3 of their portion of that group were actually U.S. citizens that proved U.S. citizenship when they registered to vote in the county. So again, the 2,000 might be more like 300. And so these are tiny errors. They're small fluctuations.
Those are also just people that registered to vote. That's not even that they voted.
And they didn't even necessarily vote.
register.
Very, very good point.
Right, it's like single digits is the number of people who've been confirmed as voting as non-citizens, right?
Yes. And I have other states with very similar data. In Louisiana, same thing. In Missouri, the state did all this, and then 70 county clerks actually went and protested against the SAVE Act.
Famously woke county clerks.
Yeah, very woke. Yeah. And they said that when they looked at their data, 1/3 of the people that it flagged as non-citizens actually were registered to vote after their naturalization ceremony. The actual registration form had a flag that said it happened when they were naturalized. Yeah, that was more than 1/3 of the people. So they're just like, I'm done with this. It's creating a ton of work for us. These people are citizens, enough. And what's also funny about this is the SAVE Act would require people to present paper documentation that shows that they are U.S. citizens. So often like a passport or a number of other things. And the people who don't have that, the list is a little bit funky. One of the biggest groups of people who don't have that documentation are married women in the U.S. who change their names. Right. About 80% of women in the U.S. change their names when they get married. I did not. I don't know why I stuck with Schwartz. Not my favorite name, but I did. And for that reason, they don't have documentation that shows their new married name. And a lot of them are conservative women, not necessarily Democrats who like to keep their names. And then, of course, there's some younger people who just don't have their act together, don't have their documentation. Older people who lost it, or they got it a long time ago, or aren't in the system because they were born maybe before federal databases included their information. And then Latinos also have a tough time with this. So those are some of the groups that are left out if you go with a SAVE Act, a federal system where people have to provide specific paper documentation to prove of citizenship.
It's confusing because the SAVE system is this garbage system. The SAVE Act stands for something else entirely. They're both connected to this nonsense about voter fraud. But if the SAVE Act were to pass, which to be clear, Trump really, really wants it to pass, it is really pressuring Congress hard. He's pressuring them to kill the filibuster so that he can get it done before the midterms. If that passed tomorrow, then you're saying millions of people would have to find their birth certificates and bring them to the polls to vote. Because if you don't have a passport with your current legal name, your driver's license won't suffice. Is that right?
Yep, exactly. You'd actually have to have a piece of paper, usually a passport or a birth certificate. And I think with the birth certificate, you might also need something with either your address or your picture on it, because a birth certificate alone, it might not be you.
Oh my God.
So I have to double check that, but every state has a different list of documentation that you can provide.
I feel like there's been a lot of disingenuity when they're talking about this, right? Because a lot of what you hear is like, oh, well, you have to show your license to get on a plane, or you have to, they're saying that that's all it is. And I don't think it's been entirely clear how hard this will be for a lot of people. And then even, if you lose your birth certificate, back to administrative burden, right? It can be complicated
Oh
and
my
a whole
God.
process
Like,
to get a new one
don't even get
issued.
me started. Our son, one of our middle son had a bunch of errors on his birth certificate. And we were like, we had just had a kid. So we were like in a fog and we missed the 30-day deadline for a free change. And so I had to spend weeks going back and forth to the DC records office just to get the birth certificate corrected. So we don't make it easy.
So Kansas actually had something very much like what the Federal SAVE Act would be. It required people to actually provide documents when they registered to vote. And it was super expensive for them because it took a lot of clerk time, and it was super expensive to implement because they had to implement this new field that someone had presented their U.S. citizenship. And it blocked over 30,000 people in just 2 years from potentially voting. And in court, they basically conceded that 99% of the voters who were affected, that 30,000, were actually U.S. citizens. So they did all this work. They spent all this money. They ended up getting taken to court. And it turned out it was all for nothing because almost every single 99% of those voters who were unable to vote, unable to register for U.S. citizens.
Well, I mean, it was all for nothing if you assume that the purpose was to prevent voter fraud. It was very effective if you assume that the real purpose was to prevent disfavored voters from another party from voting. I mean,
Right.
or maybe not. I don't know if we even know that. I mean, it was effective if the goal was to scare people who skew Democrat or scare people who skew low income or scare people who skew non-white. And it was very effective. So people know what they're doing.
Do you think that all this conversation will chill people from voting in the midterm?
I think they might be chilled from voting just because they don't want to be in a public place where there's often a police presence and other kinds of intimidating issues. I'm not sure, unless sometimes people hear something and they think that it already exists. Like, I might just account because I never proved my citizenship when I registered. I just filled it out at the library or something. So maybe indirectly, I don't know. I don't know. What do others think?
I think people are going to be chilled from voting because of all the things that they're doing to make it harder for people to vote. So the Supreme Court's decision on the gerrymandering, I think a lot of people are like, well, why am I going to vote? Like, what's the point? It's not going to count for anything. So I think in terms of this being a piece of the administration's war on democracy and people voting, taken with all the other things that they're doing, I think a lot of people are not going to vote.
And I think there's a risk of sending ICE or other federal immigration law enforcement folks in states like Texas and Florida to the polls, and seeing how that goes.
We have 20 minutes. I think we can do this. I think we can do immigration benefits, and I think we can do the irony of the fraud that the Trump administration has perpetrated. Are you guys with me? Can we do this?
Yeah, I think so. What about you, Claire?
Yeah, I think we could hit on immigration benefit fraud.
Yes. Okay. But before we do, I just have to say, and I'm pointing the finger at us in our community, the term immigration benefits is terrible. We should never use it. It just, people immediately are going to think welfare, right? Immigration benefits doesn't mean welfare. Immigration benefits, we should call something else. I don't know. Immigration services, immigration status. We're talking about people filing for something they're eligible for. Filing for immigration benefits is like filing for a tax refund, right? But we're not talking about welfare right now. We're talking about, I am applying for a green card. I'm applying for citizenship. I'm applying for a work permit, whatever. And here again, shockingly, the Trump administration is alleging widespread fraud. People applying for things they're not eligible for, faking that they're eligible for things. Is that what we're talking about now, Claire?
Yeah, I think we're talking about, all the conversation that has also been swirling around asylum fraud, refugee fraud, and some of the things that they have done to highlight those. From right when the administration came in, the initial executive orders from the president, I guess there was a 2025 memo saying the immigration bar and powerful big law pro bono practices frequently coach clients to conceal their past or lie about their circumstances when asserting their asylum claims, all in an attempt to circumvent immigration policies enacted to protect our national security and deceive the immigration authorities and courts into granting them undeserved relief. So from the very start, right, they've come in on a tone of there's fraud happening in the asylum process. And then actually, I think quite scarily and very recently, DHS General Counsel Percival put out a memo just, I think, last week, talking about sort of it's quote unquote standard practice for immigration attorneys representing illegal aliens to assert that virtually every illegal alien is going to be persecuted or tortured in his or her home country, and sort of delegating to ICE an instruction to start addressing asylum fraud. And I don't think that we really know how this is going to play out. And I certainly fear that it's the duty of the attorney representing somebody to zealously advocate for them, right? And to try to pursue relief and to work with their client. And I certainly worry that they're going to start using this to further interrupt due process, to further scare people off from representing clients in court by going after them for just bringing asylum claims.
They're accusing not only the immigrants, but the attorneys of committing fraud, of bringing fraudulent asylum cases. You're going to go out there on a limb and guess based on no evidence.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that they presented any evidence other than vibes. I think all of us know, just like when we talked about public benefits fraud, like, of course, there are some cases that are fraudulent, right? But those are generally identified, addressed. USCIS has pretty rigorous tools that they've used for years to look at asylum filings, to compare for repeat stories. This is something that has happened and has been addressed internally for quite some time.
Yeah, not just in asylum, but across all benefits, right? There's a whole directorate within USCIS called the Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate that is dedicated to fraud. And I've seen some of their work, and I would be suspicious of data that they're using now to claim that any application type has a lot of fraud in it. I'm trying to be diplomatic here.
Yeah, that was very diplomatic. Can I be undiplomatic?
Yes, go ahead.
Look, I mean, let's be clear. It's personal to some extent, right? The Trump administration is constantly saying in all their press releases, we are cleaning up the fraud that the Biden administration allowed to happen. The Biden administration let all this fraud happen. Fraud, Biden. And finally, there's a new sheriff in town and we're going to clean up all this fraud. It's all lies. And I'll give a very specific example. A lot of restrictionists believe that every U.S. citizen who marries an immigrant is committing immigration fraud, that it's not true love, that it's like the Gérard Depardieu movie Green Card, that again, none of our Gen Z listeners will have any clue what I'm talking about, but the people only get married to commit fraud because everyone wants that green card. And there's a kernel of truth. Sometimes there are fraudulent marriages, but it's a very, very small minority. And it's important to suss that out. Sonya, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say my parents, 53 years.
And you just found out it was fraudulent? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, definitely fraudulent. My mom.
That sounds really painful. Anyway, so yeah, it's important for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to have practices in place to figure out who's faking their marriage. The integrity of the system is really important. And so the civil servants came up with a very rigorous set of risk factors that we're not going to say what they are because that would give away the game. But suffice it to say, there are certain things that are correlated with marriage fraud, and there are certain things that are highly correlated with not marriage fraud. Like, for example, being married for decades, having biological children together. I think it stands to reason that those people are not committing marriage fraud. And because they're not committing marriage fraud, you don't need to bring them in for an interview. You can just process their application for a green card without wasting everybody's time. At least that was the case until the Trump administration. And now they're basically saying we have to interview every single person married to a U.S. citizen, no matter how many biological children you have with them, no matter how long they've been married, which is not a way to, quote unquote, get tough on fraud. That is a way to waste everybody's time and alienate and intimidate immigrants and their U.S. citizen spouses and encourage them to give up and go home.
So a little bit similar to what you're talking about provider fraud. I know we talked about how they're going after the immigration attorneys. I think there has been some fraud perpetrated against non-citizens by attorneys, by people misrepresenting, what they might be eligible for. And I think that probably in many cases, the biggest problematic actors are these likely U.S. citizen attorneys, et cetera, misleading their clients.
What do you all make of all of USCIS's data? Because they do like putting out data about fraud, right? They're like,
they put out data about fraud referrals. They put out data about, suspected fraud. They never give you a numerator and a denominator about
they put out
actual
numbers.
fraud was caught.
I'll take that back. They put out numbers about fraud.
Yes, they definitely put out numbers. Big numbers, big scary numbers.
That like OPT announcement from ICE, like the, soon to be departed director of ICE announced they had 10,000 cases for the optional practical training program where they have suspected fraud.
Suspected fraud.
Right, exactly. It could be anything from, who knows, like wrong zip codes or, basic information mistyped to maybe fraud, but it's still nebulous as to be meaningless.
Right. Just to go back to the top, right? Like if you repeat the word enough times, fraud, suddenly it just seeps into your consciousness and people think that there is all of this rampant fraud. But I would like to talk about who the real fraudsters are.
I'm at the edge of my seat, Amanda.
It is ironic that we are talking about fraud perpetrated by immigrants when this administration has ignored and facilitated fraud by a lot of unsavory actors. So, for example, from February through early December of last year, the president issued 61 pardons and commutations. Nearly half of those benefited white-collar criminals who had committed securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, fraud, tax evasion, and other similar offenses, fraud. So an example is the executive behind BitMEX, which I guess is cryptocurrency. I don't know a lot about cryptocurrency.
I'm sure it's legit.
Who had pleaded guilty to anti-money laundering violations. Another CEO of OZ Media, he was convicted of financial conspiracy. An electric truck CEO, convicted of defrauding shareholders. So there's a lot of fraud happening that the administration is letting happen and letting go. They've also abandoned a lot of fraud cases that were being prosecuted at the Department of Justice. ProPublica reported on this. They looked at 2 decades of DOJ data. And in the first 6 months of the Trump administration, DOJ closed 23,000 criminal cases related to a lot of investigation, but also white-collar fraud. Doge, right? A horrible, horrible entity that closed USAID and said that they were rooting out fraud. The fraud that they rooted out, the DOJ declined over 900 cases of federal program or procurement fraud. So declined. That's 900 cases of fraud that was actually happening that they declined to prosecute. And then there's just so many more fraud-focused efforts that they have taken their eye off of. They've paused the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits U.S. citizens and companies from bribing foreign officials to advance their business interests.
I'm sure that's fine. I'm sure that has nothing to do with the president's sons and son-in-law.
So there are a lot of the administration's buddies who are perpetrating fraud that they're ignoring, right? And then talking about fraud, going after people who have very, very little and have a lot to lose, but are being painted as fraudsters.
Yeah. And even worse, as Claire said, are more likely to be victims of fraud.
Right.
Right? One of the frustrations, I think, when we were inside government is that when we did find fraud on the part of an employer or on the part of an attorney or what have you, the only remedy was we had to terminate the immigrant's status. It was like, oh, well, that was a fraudulent application because you got bad advice from a, unscrupulous lawyer, or you were hired by an unscrupulous employer. And the fraudster didn't get punished because we didn't have the authority to punish the fraudster. It was the immigrant that got punished by losing their status and having to go home. You see this time and time again. This isn't even a Trump thing, but there's this visa program called the EB-5. It's like an investor visa. It's not the gold card. Everyone settle down. But it's always described as like the fraud-riddled EB-5 investor visa program. And it is. There's just so much fraud. But the fraud is the Americans creating the investment projects and going and getting credulous rich people from China and Iran and other countries to invest in these projects to get their green card. It's almost never the immigrants who are committing the fraud. It's us. We are the fraudsters. The polling indicates that these lies about immigrant fraud are working because an insane percentage of Americans of both parties and independents have let it seep into their brains because I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. Sonya, what's the answer? How do we fight back against this really ugly tsunami of rhetoric? Is that a fair question?
It's also different. It's also different. I mean, honestly, when it comes to voter fraud, alleged voter fraud, for me, even though we have this data that's so convincing that it's almost never, ever, ever happening, I think there's still people out there that can't get it through their head. They just want us to have a system that checks every single person. And so in some cases, it's worth having a system, one that really works, that shows everyone that every single person who's registered to vote is a U.S. citizen. But it's going to take a lot of hard work of government, not burning government down, but actually building systems that work well so that everyone can understand, that's transparent, that's clear, that everyone knows what the process is, that people will have faith. I'm okay with that. It's a lot of work to build those systems, right? And I don't think, obviously, this administration has any interest in setting up anything like that. They just want to burn it all down. So
that's such a lovely good faith idea. Unfortunately, the cynic/realist in me, I don't think it's cynical at all. It's like, let's say we snapped our fingers and had the perfect technology, right? You're still going to have something called,
edge cases.
Edge cases. Like, there's no perfect system. There will always be a little bit of fuzz. There will always be a little bit like a margin of error. There will always be a little standard deviation of error. Every product has defects, right? No matter how hard you try. And so that's all it'll take. That's all it'll take. We could have gone through this entire $1 perfect system, and we'll be right back where we started.
I mean, I think we have to do a good job pointing out their defects, like Amanda was, and walking through some of the people who are committing fraud and how it happens and where the real money is in some of these systems. They're just so good at it. They are unrelenting. They find one case, one story, and you see it everywhere. And especially, they're good at doing it in a visceral way. They use a lot of images. I mean, when have you ever seen a US president send out or have a link to a website with the faces of like hundreds of men that are mugshots and that are literally, maybe there'll be one who is not Black or brown in that whole visual? I've just never seen that before. That they're using this visceral imagery constantly about people who are committing fraud in a way that we've never done. We could create that and show sort of all the white men behind these fraud schemes across the country, financial fraud, investment fraud.
We could limit it to just senators.
We just don't do it. Yeah. Anyway, I think we have to get better also at countering the narrative.
I think we still have a lot of work as a society to figure out. Sonya, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Sonya, thank you so much.
And we will melt away now. Thanks for melting down with us today. You can follow and subscribe to The Melting Pod wherever you get your podcasts. Our website is meltingpod.org, and you can find us on YouTube and Instagram. Drop us a line with any questions and let us know how we can improve the show. And you can check the show notes for organizations that are working hard to make our immigration system more sane and humane and that deserve your support. Until we melt again.